I think our sort of weakness is what actually provokes them, not giving ATACMS to the Ukrainians, but our weakness is what provokes them to feel like these guys are not going to do anything, and so that's why they feel emboldened to do what they do.
Ukraine is successfully conducting multi domain operations in accordance with NATO training and strategic precepts. Successful long range precision strikes against Russian energy and transportation infrastructure, a land centric counteroffensive in Kursk that is changing the war's momentum and narrative. Should allies just provide munitions and get out of the way instead of imposing red lines? Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please, if you do find this video valuable, like and make sure you are subscribed in order not to miss the new content that is published on a near daily basis. And please also check out my new channel, Silicon Wafers, that features in-depth news coverage of the Russo-Ukrainian war and events internally that are going on in Russian politics. Subscribers will be able to enjoy an extra 5 minutes of bonus video from this discussion with Ben Hodges. That extra bit, you should definitely check that out. Make sure you subscribe to the new channel. That extra video will cover the top tactical priorities that will help to ensure a Ukrainian victory. Ben Hodges is a retired United States Army officer who became commander of the United States Army Europe in November 2014 and held that position for 3 years until retiring from the Army in January 2018. Until recently, he was the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis, specialising in NATO, the transatlantic relationship, and international security. And before we jump into the video, please do check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description. It's incredibly important that we help Ukrainians to remain resilient at this time. Please also, if you like this material, buy me a coffee to help support the work of the channel. Well, Ben, I'm absolutely delighted that you could join us again. I know the audience massively appreciate the conversations we have and our ability to dive deeply into some of the issues over this extended format. Thanks for coming back on. Let's start straight with, I think, the difficult question. Is the Kursk counteroffensive as huge as it actually seems, is it only the start? Because now we have incursions into Bryansk and Belgorod, which was reported yesterday, and it seems that Ukraine is starting to retake parts of Kharkiv, which Russians made incursions into earlier in the year. This leads me to think that this is just the start of what are going to be a series of astonishing actions, which could potentially culminate in the retaking of Crimea. Is this overly optimistic? What's your sense?
I don't think it's overly optimistic. Once again, we have been exposed for underestimating Ukraine and overestimating Russia. The fact that the Ukrainians could mass so much combat power and all the attendant logistics and ammunition, etc., and protect that information so that they could surprise Russia by attacking across the border in this counteroffensive really is quite an accomplishment by the Ukrainian general staff and their soldiers and by the government. We still don't know exactly what the objectives are, nor should we know. We're not entitled to know that. And again, kudos to the general staff for protecting information, what we call OPSEC, operational security. Because if we know, then the Russians will know. But judging from the effects they've achieved thus far, it seems that at the strategic level, the objective was to change the narrative, to change the momentum of this conflict, which for the last several months has been seen like more of a slog than anything. Now, all of a sudden, you've got people talking about Ukrainian troops inside Russia, and creating dilemmas for the Kremlin. So this change of momentum, change of narrative, challenging the notion that Russian victory is inevitable. And it also gives the Ukrainians the chance to wipe out some sanctuary that the Russians have had on their side of the border for attacks against Ukraine. So by pushing the line, it makes it difficult for the Russians to keep attacking the way they were. And despite continued U.S. restrictions on Ukraine using long-range weapons, Ukrainians can now move forward with their own systems to strike deeper into Russia against airfields and oil and gas infrastructure. So I think that's one of the main strategic outcomes of this counteroffensive thus far.
And in some of your recent interviews, you've called it a bridgehead. But I think this is an interesting concept, isn't it? Because many of the analysts who've been looking at this are thinking of a bridgehead to what? You know, more conventional warfare. It's also a bridgehead to more unconventional and asymmetric attacks. Obviously, I don't have details on what those might be, but we have seen Russian Legion and various other extraordinary acts and reconnaissance acts, sabotage acts on the territory of Crimea. This could be a bridgehead for some extraordinary Ukrainian creativity.
So I failed to answer the first part of your original question. You're right. This is not a standalone operation. In fact, the more I think about the broader context of what's happening, I'm even more impressed with what Ukrainians are achieving. The operation itself, logistically, technically, intelligence, targeting, etc., is complicated enough, but it's happening while they are having to protect their rear area against massive Russian air attacks. They are striking deep into Russia to hit airfields and destroying those priceless bombers, and also destroying parts of the Russian oil and gas infrastructure, which has not only economic impact, obviously, but also psychological impact. And then they just destroyed what I think is the last or one of the last ferries that connects Crimea to the Russian mainland. So all of these things are going on at the same time. And by the way, they're still holding off Russian attacks in the east near Pokrovsk. So really impressive job by the General Staff and the GUR to in terms of targeting, allocating resources, prioritization, and the willingness to accept risk in the east, because I think that they can see that the Russians are not going to overwhelm or break through somehow near Pokrovsk, even if Pokrovsk eventually is taken in the coming weeks or whatever it is. I think you have correctly identified, Jonathan, that this bridgehead is a start to something that's much bigger, whether it's broadening the bridgehead itself, using it for bringing in their own long-range weapon systems, or maybe even to prevent a situation at the end where Russia would settle for a frozen conflict with Ukraine controlling a large part of Russian territory.
I suspect Ukraine needs a lot more leverage before it can claim to have Putin over a barrel. I think that's also interesting. We see in a lot of West analysis, they tend to assume that Ukraine will take a bit of territory, maybe hold on, maybe not, stick there. But actually, this could be an underestimation. It seems that Ukraine has a couple of options here. They could, for instance, go on a bit of a road trip down to Donetsk, although it seems that the geography and the distances are pretty substantial. It may be difficult to hold that terrain. They could perhaps go on a little road trip north to Smolensk, in that sense, cut off Belarus. It's interesting perhaps to see that Belarus is massing troops in a threatening gesture along the border there. What might happen if Ukraine went for incredibly bold moves and sought to, say, topple Belarus, or Lukashenko managed to do it himself by agreeing to participate in Putin's pointless war?
Well, I think first of all, we should not underestimate Ukraine's ability or their willingness to take risk. I mean, they're fighting for their survival, and they're not getting the support from the West that they need to actually win this war. So they're having to do some things to try and change that narrative, but also to do what's necessary to survive, regardless of people's complaints or criticisms or tapping the brakes. I think that each of the possibilities you just laid out are viable, but I mean, those would be extremely risky. And at some point, the Russians will get their act together, presumably. Thus far, fortunately, because the general staff and the FSB hate each other so intensely, they're not cooperating very well, and that helps in terms of intelligence and reactions and so on. And also, where the Ukrainians are helped by the geography of the what in military theory is called interior lines. Their ability to move forces, say from the border or Kharkiv down to the east, is a much shorter distance than Russian forces would have to go around on exterior lines. And of course, the Ukrainians know this terrain. They know the population better than any of us will ever know, and they understand the significance of certain rivers, the transportation networks, and I am fairly certain that they are doing a lot of damage out there on railroads and other things, more than just the 3 bridges that they've already destroyed.
And this is a fascinating point you make there. Of course, they know the terrain, they know the Russian tactics, they know the sort of training that the Russians have gone through, but they also understand the Russian mindset. Do you think this operation is built much more around an understanding of the political and psychological impact and the stress this is going to place on what you mentioned already, rivalries between different security services? Ukrainians are now fighting based on their knowledge of Russians and their weaknesses, not on, let's say, purely Western conventional techniques and strategies.
You said it better than I could have. I think, I would never be able to understand how Russians think about things or understand um, the hatred and rivalries between the various parts of the Russian government and infrastructure and security services the way that a Ukrainian would. Of course, they are playing on this, and they didn't just pick a spot on the map where they thought they had light Russian defenses. This part of Kursk and Bryansk, these are areas that over the centuries there has been a strong Ukrainian sort of presence, influence. The population there, I think, has a significantly different mentality than, say, Russians that live up closer to Moscow or further west of Moscow. That would not be a surprise to the Ukrainians either. And so when you look at how the Ukrainian troops are acting when they go into these towns, literally paying for things that they take from a store compared to what happens when the Red Army shows up somewhere inside Ukraine. That's not just because they're nice people. This is intelligent. One of the biggest mistakes that the German Wehrmacht made in 1941 was that they caused so much damage everywhere they went, killing people, that they ended up with a massive rear area security problem, because the Ukrainians, who might have been willing to welcome them because they were going to get away from Stalin, became the most challenging partisans. So I think this is smart militarily as well as from a humanitarian standpoint.
You mentioned something interesting there. So we talked about the Russian mindset, but it also seems Ukrainians have started to understand the Western mindset and take the bits from that are beneficial, and they seem to starting to be rejecting those bits that aren't. So two of the things we see in this Kursk counteroffensive, the use of secrecy and surprise. Now, Western partners seem to have been a huge liability in this sense. We'll perhaps come to the political dimension in a minute. It seems to me that all the way through, no matter what we've provided in terms of munitions, the scale and the types of munitions, we seem to have tried to avoid those two things, secret and surprise, almost along the way, as if we have tried to signal to Russia in advance, look, we're about to do this, don't freak out, don't press any red buttons. This strategy in military terms is not particularly effective, is it? Dispensing with those two extraordinary techniques of secrecy and surprise,
especially against a peer adversary like Russia. We spent the last 20 years fighting against Iraqis and Taliban and in counterterrorism, where you had overwhelming technical dominance, overwhelming manpower, overwhelming everything. except political will. And so, the idea that you would have to use great secrecy or to do things in such a way to help defeat Russian forces without the benefit of overwhelming air power, overwhelming artillery, overwhelming logistics. Um, I hope that we're taking notes. I hope that we're watching how the Ukrainians are doing all this. And I think the Ukrainians, um, and because we've spoken before, I was overly optimistic last year about the counteroffensive that Ukraine led. I think the Ukrainians just said, okay, we're going to do this our way. We don't have the stuff that the Americans would always have or that the Brits would always have, so we have to do it our way. And that's where their knowledge of their enemy, the knowledge of the terrain, comes into being such a valuable uh, asset. The fact that the border force is under control of FSB, and border forces are usually the most corrupt of all because that's where you can make so much money with smuggling, et cetera, and that it was so lightly defended, that that would not have been a surprise to the Ukrainians.
And it's interesting, isn't it? We will only know from the history books whether some assurances were given to Russia that such an incursion wouldn't take place, or whether it's an assumption on their part. I guess all we can do is speculate on that. You will, in your role, have had some experience of dealing with politicians and the administration and the bureaucracy and so on, and interfacing with that. Whereas publicly, Ukraine's allies have greeted the incursions of the Kursk counteroffensive either neutrally or made warm and positive noises. Do you think behind the scenes there are going to be certain groups and individuals that are absolutely having kittens about what is unfolding?
I think you're exactly right. I have been relieved somewhat that there have not been outcries from Washington or London or Berlin to please stop. You're going to provoke the Russians. I think that that kind of unhelpful noise has not been as prevalent as it has in the past. Although I have heard a couple of idiotic statements coming from the Pentagon about, well, the Ukrainians don't really need long range weapons because those don't help them defend. I mean, what person that ever spent one day looking at a military book would come to that conclusion that you would not need long range weapons to strike the source of the enemy's attacks? I mean, that unfortunately, that's a Pentagon spokesman that said that the other day. It's unbelievable. And I also believe that there are still too many people in the administration and with access to the administration that believe that somehow the worst thing in the world that could happen would be a collapse of the Putin regime. And so while they don't like Russia and they don't want Ukraine to suffer or to be defeated, the worst thing for them is a collapse of the Russian Federation government because they're terrified of what might happen. And I think this kind of excessive fear has paralyzed good strategic thinking in the West, but particularly in Washington.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because that escalation management, as the label's been sort of put on it, is a definable strategy, I think, through the course of the war. We have ceded the escalation dominance to Russia almost at every point until, as you pointed out here, Ukraine has taken the initiative recently. Whereas that might have managed risk in the short to medium term, has it actually increased the long-term risk? I.e., we've allowed Putin to believe he could gain a victory. We've allowed him to believe that we would place preventing World War III above Ukraine's survival as strategic priorities. This has allowed him to carry on, but it seems to be placing the Russian economy and its political structure under more and more strain, which means the collapse, when it comes, is possibly going to be that much more catastrophic. Do you think that is true? And why is the administration missing this idea?
There's this famous quote from Hemingway's book, The Sun Also Rises, where one of the characters is asked by the other one. The story takes place in the 20s and 30s, And he's asked, how did you go bankrupt? And the other guy answers, slowly and then suddenly. And so I think that's what's going to happen in Russia. I have not met anybody. You may be the only person, Jonathan, that in 1988 predicted that the Soviet Union was going to collapse in the next year. I've not met anybody that said, I called it. And so we were not prepared for that. And I think while I don't advocate that the U.S. government get directly involved in regime change, we have a terrible record of that in the past, that we should not be afraid of it. And then we should help accelerate it by helping Ukraine defeat Russia. And if that leads to the downfall of Vladimir Putin and people around him, all the better. In the meanwhile, all of our best economists, our best energy experts, our best, you name it, should be focused on what if. What if that happens? What happens to the nuclear weapons? Nothing happened to them, by the way, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. What happens to the energy infrastructure? The Chinese and Indians will be very interested in what happens to that. But I think that we should plan for it, be prepared for it, versus constantly trying to stop it.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that the evidence of Russia saying they have red lines and then really, in reality, not having the red lines that we imagine they had. There are other evidence on the ground of what might happen after Vladimir Putin's collapse. And it's interesting to see that as Ukraine has taken Russian territory, we do not see people on the streets throwing Molotov cocktails. We do not see protests. We actually see Russians buckling down to exist under a new master. That new master, the Ukrainians, have shown themselves to be extraordinarily, I would say, gentle and with a degree of sort of kindness and organization. Is this something we should be observing and thinking about more deeply? Because it seems that Russians are not that keen to actually die for their Tsar, and they're quite happy to, as I say, realign under a new master if that master brings a degree of security and order.
I have tried over the last few years to understand how Russians think about things, to understand the Russian population. I have not mastered that at all. But it does seem that the majority of the Russian population is apathetic, let's say, because of centuries of, unless you were in the inner circle, the oligarchs, or near the power, your life was going to be shit anyway. And so it's kind of like, oh, well. The fact that the Kremlin avoids sending too many troops or recruiting too many kids from Moscow and St. Petersburg so that you don't have funerals in those cities is, I think, intended to avoid creating a situation where Russians actually start paying attention to, like, what the heck is going on here? I think that because Putin doesn't have to answer to journalists or tough podcast moderators, or really doesn't have to answer to the voters, he can do what he wants to do until the people closest to him and around him begin to realize they're going to lose. And I think that's the one thing that will be unacceptable is losing. And so he could end up being toppled or sent into retirement or something. So for him, he's just going to keep doubling down no matter how many people are killed. That's not a factor or consideration for him, in my view. So the target for Ukraine's operations and for what we should be doing is exacerbating those frictions between all the different institutions inside of Russia. I hope that we are reaching out to various oligarchs and telling them, look, you're never going to get your yacht back. You're never going to get back to your mistress on the Adriatic. You're never going to be able to send your kid to school in London. Never, 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 as long as this continues. And that sort of information effort, in my view, is just as important as what's happening on the ground.
And You have, in recent interviews, started to examine the Ukrainian tactics themselves. So we see the overall strategy is highly innovative, but it seems that they may have employed some interesting tactics and technologies in order to break through Russian lines. What do we know so far about that? What is it safe to talk about, especially, for instance, the use of drones and electronic warfare to counter the Russian drone defenses?
So this is something that is very interesting to me, and I want to learn more. But of course, the Ukrainians are protecting this information. How have they managed what appears to have created some sort of a bubble that degrades Russian drone surveillance? I mean, how else could the Ukrainians have gotten so much force that close to the border without being detected? And I think it's a combination of counter drone efforts that are kinetic as well as non-kinetic that is able to somehow uh, degrade Russian surveillance capabilities. I read just a couple of days ago about a group of Ukrainian drone operators that were trained in UK on how to use a particular type of capability. I think there's a lot of these things going on that we don't know about. Um, and the Ukrainians have figured out, that they have to, or they know they have to figure out how to counter Russia's advantage in electronic warfare and in drone numbers. And so I think probably soon we're going to know more about the how that they have done this. But I think also there's still some good old-fashioned disciplined fieldcraft of camouflage. I spoke to a gentleman the other day who had just gone through the breach. They had driven across the border with Ukrainian forces, was able to look around, and he said he was astounded by how much Ukrainian military force and logistics were as they approached the border that were off into the forest. He said it was incredible how much was there. And then when he got on the other side of the border, there was a scattering of dragon's teeth and some barbed wire, but that was it. So I think this is due to disciplined uh, in terms of OPSEC, but also fieldcraft.
Course, it's created a challenge for Putin. I rather suspect that this may be one of the main aims of this. The challenge, of course, as you've pointed out in recent conversations, is physically moving troops from the southern and eastern fronts. It's a long way, and Russia may not have the logistics, the trucks, rail, etc., and those may be vulnerable to strikes as well. But it seems there's a political dimension. It seems that Putin doesn't want to do two things. He doesn't want to let up against Pokrovsk. He wants a propaganda political victory, and retaking Kursk would not give him that propaganda benefit. Equally, it seems that Ukraine is trying to goad Putin into full mobilization. This is something he's avoided for 2.5 years. Do you think this is really, really important to put Russian resources, troop numbers under extreme duress so Putin is forced to take more bodies and potentially from the larger, more educated urban centers?
Well, very good points. I think one of the aims of the counteroffensive was to do everything that you just described, to create political dilemmas for Putin, force him to, to connect him to this thing. He has a habit of leaving town when there's a catastrophe. He was recently, after this Kursk counteroffensive had started, he was out in Azerbaijan and Baku, and then he was doing other meetings, trying to keep a distance between himself and the catastrophe. He put the FSB in charge of the response to the Kursk counteroffensive to kind of support the narrative that this is a terrorist operation by the Ukrainians. So he's going to put his best counterterrorism team against it, which is ridiculous. But this is part of because he is concerned about how people think about things and the image there inside Russia. And so at some point, he is going to have to make a decision of, do you just let this thing fester in Kursk and keep hoping to finally capture Pokrovsk, um, whatever that means. I mean, I do think that The descriptor strategically important city of is grossly overused by Western media. I mean, Avdiivka was strategically important, Bakhmut was, and so um, I think that if he believes that he can finally capture Pokrovsk, then he can turn all of his attention to Kursk. That's going to take a very long time. And as you alluded to earlier, Jonathan, the I don't think that the Ukrainians are just going to go in a few kilometers and then start putting up fortifications. I don't think they're planning to stop where they are right now.
Yeah, Avdiivka is hardly Stalingrad, is it? Um, and this is something I think the media perhaps has trouble wrapping its head around. The idea that Ukraine can cede territory in return for some advantage, and that advantage may be the huge attritional losses of the Russian forces. We seem to panic at every single loss of a territory, perhaps forgetting strategies used by Manstein and others in the past, which is to cede territory for advantage. Do you think the Ukrainians actually have a stronger grasp on this and can see the advantage to moving back to defended positions after they've squeezed, the highest toll from the Russian forces at the lowest possible toll on their side?
I think that's exactly what they're doing is, I mean, people who admiringly look at Russian history of how they defeated Napoleon, how they defeated Hitler, was always by withdrawing into the vast depths of Russia until their invader was overstretched. Then they go back and destroy it. Well, I think that this is probably that idea would not be novel for the Ukrainians to do this. Although they, of course, when you're giving up your own homeland and knowing that Russian forces, what happens when they show up in a town or a village, but the this is why I think that General Sirski and his team felt confident that they could continue to accept some risk in the east to allocate enough forces for this counteroffensive because he sees that the Russians don't have the ability to just overwhelm. There's not going to be some big gigantic red arrow arching across the Ukrainian steppes because the Russians, I just don't think they have that ability. Only this very incremental 6 months, 50 kilometers. That's how far they've moved.
And the cost of that, it's estimated to be 1,000 plus Russian casualties per day, which is a huge, huge number, isn't it?
Yeah, at some point, even Russia runs out of people. Um, I saw something the other day that said the average age was like up around 38 or something like that. I mean, that's now they're approaching me and you in terms of age. And so I think that the thing that's not included in these big numbers is who's been lost, and it's the officers and the sergeants or more senior soldiers that have experience that are needed to help train the next group. They're all dead. I mean, they're gone. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a Ukrainian officer, and he said, they used to always have the greatest respect for the VDV, the Russian airborne, and for the naval infantry. But those guys, they're all dead. And so now while you may have the unit, the airborne unit with the shoulder patch, all the people are like third generation new guys. So it's very difficult to replace experienced soldiers in a short amount of time. And that doesn't mean just people that know how to go into a bunker or a trench line, but also people that know how to do the logistics, to anticipate what's going to be required to do the hard work of managing trucks and rail cars and thousands of rounds of ammunition and hundreds of thousands of liters of fuel. This is very, very hard work. And you don't just pull somebody out of a shopping center and put them in charge of your logistics. So this is a part of the manpower challenge I think that the Russians are facing now.
And one of the cruel ironies is that Russia seems to be firing a lot more, projectiles and having a lot more ordnance of various types than we would have predicted perhaps 2 years ago. There were conversations 2 years ago, well, they're running out now, and there's clearly no sign of that happening. And many of the Kinjals and so on that are being fired across, the Russian-made ones, have been demonstrated to contain a lot of foreign components, including US components. And the cruel irony is that Ukraine is not allowed to hit the launch sites. It's still the strategy of targeting arrows and not the archer. Firstly, seems to be unsustainable, and constantly having to resupply Patriots and so on, which are extremely expensive bits of kit. Ukraine has supplied a list of targets it would like to hit, and those discussions are going on with John Kirby at the moment behind closed doors. How important is it that Ukraine is given selective permission to hit certain launch sites for Shaheeds and the various projectiles?
Churchill was so concerned about the German V-1 and V-2 bombs that were being launched from the Netherlands against Great Britain during the war that, parts of the invasion plans were aimed to eliminate those spots. And also, of course, our efforts by the U.S. Air Force and the Royal Air Force were aimed at the German Air Force to take out their bases rather than trying to sitting back to shoot down every German airplane that flew over Great Britain. So this is exactly the right approach to go after the source of these attacks. And I think it is disgusting and disheartening that this is not that the administration has not embraced what is such an obvious thing to do, that they are still afraid when Lavrov comes out like he did 2 days ago and says, "Oh, we may need to clarify our doctrine for use of nuclear weapons." This is just once again they send the old guy out there and he uses the N-word in order to remind us they have nuclear weapons. And I don't understand why we are terrified of this regime that is not going to use a nuclear weapon. There is zero benefit for Russia to use a nuclear weapon. It's the threat of the use that gives them the greatest benefit.
Or they'll give Medvedev another bottle of vodka and a keyboard and let him go to town. Ukraine has just announced its own domestically built ballistic systems, which is, on the one hand, extraordinary, and the other not so extraordinary, given their engineering prowess during the Soviet period and the fact that many of the engineers, and indeed the father of the Soviet space program, was in fact Ukrainian. But again, it seems that if Ukraine is able to mass produce these ballistic systems in a timely fashion, and that is not a known at all, it means that our caution, our reserve and timidity has actually emboldened Ukraine to go far, far further. It sort of undermines the very premise behind our strategy to apparently manage the risks.
Very well said. The Ukrainians are fighting for their life, and so they're not going to just sit back and wait for the U.S. and UK to save them. And the way you describe their ability to do these kinds of things, I would agree with that completely. I think that probably 10 years from now, Ukraine is going to be the center of defense industry and weapons production in all of Europe because of what they are being forced to do and having to do and the expertise that they are accruing. I think we're going to see this kind of center of gravity of who makes the best kit is going to shift towards Ukraine. Instead of it being Germany or UK or France, it's going to end up being Ukraine in terms of quality weapon systems, anti-ship missiles, air defense expertise, and the ability to do it in a way that is much cheaper than how we produce things.
And of course, they've got the data to test these in real time. Of course, that accelerates innovation and development. But of course, the other side of this is Russia's accelerating brutality. This has been, I think, in observance really since COVID, but essentially in 2021, it increased still further, that slide towards tyranny. And we see in their prosecution of the war extraordinary brutality and contempt for civilized values, including the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. Now, in the recent missile strike on Monday and Tuesday, the largest of the war, it does seem that they were not just targeting hydroelectric capacity on the Kiev dam. They may have been trying to hit the dam itself. And there are reports that Russia has poisoned the Sim River, which is that natural fortification that in Kursk that the Ukrainians are using when they sort of take territory. There are pictures of dead fish and so on. And Russia's now threatening, saying that the Kursk nuclear power station is in danger. I'm infinitely cynical. I think Russia would be entirely capable of shelling their own nuclear power station and blaming it on the Ukrainians. They poisoned the river. They did Kakhovka. Could they try to take out the Kiev hydroelectric dam, which will cause not just huge economic dislocation, but massive humanitarian catastrophe as well?
Well, absolutely, that is believable and possible that they would do that. I can only hope that our government, your government, and others are communicating to the Kremlin that that would be even for us not something that could be tolerated. Although I don't have great faith that we are communicating that in any meaningful way. This is why I'm always um, surprised. No, this is why I cannot figure out why some people think that we could actually negotiate with Russia to find a meaningful, peaceful outcome that to which they would adhere. They have zero credibility when it comes to living up to any kind of agreements of any sort, and so they routinely flaunt disregard for international law, international agreements. Why do we think that these people were somebody that could be trusted to respect an agreement that led to some sort of negotiated settlement? Um, they only I think our sort of weakness is what actually provokes them, not giving ATACMS to the Ukrainians, but our weakness is what provokes them to feel like these guys are not going to do anything, and so that's why they feel emboldened to do what they do.
And you keep a close eye on European politics. You will know a lot of these debates going on in Germany around the defense budget. It seems that a draft budget shows a halving of support to Ukraine. German ministers come out and denied that. But this is a concern. For you, what would you say to Germans especially, but also to France and the UK? Because it seems that in recent criticism, Zelensky has pointed out that none of the major allies, including the US, have actually provided what's been promised and what has been delivered. Quite often you will find that some of the kit is old, there are faults, it needs to be reworked, rebuilt, refitted before actually it can be used in the field. Is the West falling back into its complacent slumber at a time when Ukrainian victory has never been more important?
I think, unfortunately, yes, it does feel like we've kind of taken our foot off the gas. That's attributable to, I think, a variety of things. Obviously, the U.S. Presidential election this year has diverted most American attention, unfortunately. Um, and despite the many good things that the Biden administration has done, they have failed on the critical task. So I'm a little bit reluctant to be too critical of UK or Germany or France when we're not doing very well ourselves, not in a meaningful, decisive way. But um, in Germany, of course, it's a coalition government. So you've got the SPD, the Greens, and the Liberal Democrats. And in this coalition government, the ministerial posts are divided up between the parties as part of the agreement. So you got the Liberal Democrat, Mr. Lentner, he runs the economy and the budget, and he's the one that said, I think we're not going to spend all this money. We have to fix our budget, and we'll use frozen Russian assets to pay for whatever it is that we're going to send to Ukraine. Well, that doesn't inspire confidence in anybody that Germany actually is going to keep doing it, and it certainly sends a message to Russia that Germany is not committed. And then the fact that Chancellor Scholz has been so wishy-washy all along, about all of this. Ever since he made the famous Zeitenwende declaration, it's he has not given confidence that Germany is committed to helping Ukraine. This is dangerous because you've got the richest, largest economy in Europe um, that will suffer the most. Germany will be the biggest loser if Ukraine fails. You've got millions more Ukrainian refugees will be headed straight for Dusseldorf, Cologne, Frankfurt, Berlin, Munich. They're all coming to Germany because they're not going to sit around and wait for the Red Army to show up. So I think Germany is going to economically pay an enormous price for their failure if Ukraine fails. And then the credibility of Germany is really, really low, unfortunately, because of the rise of right-wing extremism in Germany. The AfD is going to make some real gains, I think, in some elections here in the coming weeks. They are tend to be pro-Russia, anti-Ukraine, and so Germany is very vulnerable right now.
You remain, however, confident in Ukraine, and especially given the last couple of weeks, which have shown them to be both bold and innovative. You think Ukraine has what it takes to actually achieve a comprehensive victory.
If we do what we should do, absolutely. If we fail, then I think this drags on longer and longer. I can't imagine a scenario where the Ukrainians finally say, okay, that's it, because they know there's no positive outcome for Ukraine if they do that. So the duration of this conflict, the price of this conflict, only increases the more we hesitate.
But a huge pleasure speaking. Again, thank you so much for sharing your views with the channel. Always a great pleasure.
I love it. It's one of my favorite podcasts to do. Thank you very much.